Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Nice to see all these smiling faces here today. Thanks for coming out. Some of you don't know me. My name is Don Paris, and I've worked with the SE5 for about 27 years, I think it's been. And that is my wife in the back, and she's going to slip out in a minute. And, she knows just about everything I'm going to say, 10 times over. So she's going to take care of her stuff. Before I begin, I need to do my legal disclaimer. I'll let you just read this over, but basically this is saying that everything I say is basically for entertainment purposes, and I'm hoping it's going to be entertaining for you. I saved my best jokes for the middle part, so I'm going to do this talk in 3 different sections. So the first section will be some theory, and then I'll do some demonstration work where you get to see how the SE5 actually works in action. And the third part is the most exciting part for some of you. I know you've been waiting for this, is can an automatic analysis be done without a human operator? Can we get the computer to do an automatic analysis? And I'm going to save that part for last, so you'll get to get the surprise at the end. I have some really exciting, interesting new information about that. I started to develop this talk in one direction. I'll switch this so you can get to the next part of the disclaimer. And I found out by doing more research in that area, I found some things that I didn't really even know about myself. So it's good to dive into some of these things and learn about them, because you'll learn more by presenting them than being on the other side. Okay, so everybody read that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Got the small print, got the fine print. Everything we talk about when we refer to something physical is only a reference to the physical, because we're working with intrinsic data fields, which are pure informational fields. They're not physical. So if we talk about the heart, for example, what we work with the SE5 and with radionics in general is that we work with the informational fields that are associated with that organ. And this part is not just for the disclaimer. It's really important to understand the difference between the two, because if you think you're working on something physical with this type of equipment and you're accessing informational fields, you'll run into blind alleys because you're not working on the physical level. And I'm going to explain that, and you'll understand where we come from on that. How many people have lately watched my YouTube film that I put out a couple of weeks ago, where I did the talk in India at the Global Congress? Okay, quite a few of you. I'm going to review some of that information and add some more information to that in the theory section, and then the practical applications and the demonstration, and then the last part is all completely new, even for you guys. So, an intrinsic data field. What is an intrinsic data field? I mean, it's a cool word, but what is it? Okay? We're not working with energy, are we? With radionics. Or, I'm seeing some surprise spaces here. Okay, we are not working, at least from my understanding of it, and I'll show you the difference between where energy leaves off and information starts. But let me give you this analogy. We've all got the radio. We know what the radio is, and you tune in a frequency, which is an electromagnetic field that's bouncing back and forth between the antenna of the sender and the receiver, and everything's oscillating, and you've got all these great energies coming back and forth. And let's say we're tuned to 88.5 FM, right? So we're locked onto a frequency. We know exactly which antenna we're going to up on the hill. There might be 3 or 4 of them. We're locked onto that antenna, and we're receiving the signals, and you've got some great country and western music coming out for those country and western fans. Okay. And then the announcer comes on the radio and says, "Oh, by the way, George, I just heard that you just won the lottery." $8.7 million. And you call me at this number and we're going to give you the connection of how to do that, right? So George is at home, locked on to 88.5. He's got the frequency, right? He just got information, only information. What do you think is happening in George's body right now when he just won $8.7 million? Well, the adrenals are kicking in for sure, right? Yeah? Was there any energy going to George from 88.7, that frequency going back and forth from the antenna and the radio? Did it matter how loud it was? As long as he could hear it. Yeah? No. That's an informational field. Yeah? And it causes a physiological response. Yeah? I mean, his adrenals are going wild, and I can tell you, he's jumping up and down. And then the announcer comes on the radio and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, George, we made a mistake. It was me that won that $8.7 million, and you can call me later, but I might give you the 0.7 just because I made the mistake." So what do you think happens to George, his physiological chemical level, when the announcer says that on the radio? Yeah, let down. And there's a whole flood of chemicals related with that physiological response. Again, it was just information, right? It was yes or no. Yeah? That's what we're dealing with intrinsic data fields. We're dealing with informational fields, not with energy fields. So it doesn't matter how much power you have in your radionic power machine. What's really important is how clearly you can make the connection and get the information back and forth. And that, from my perspective, has to do with scalar fields. So what is scalar? We've heard a lot about scalar lately. I have a whole presentation on all the scalar devices that are out on the internet. You should Google it one time. So they've got a little pendant now. It's, I think it's amethyst, or I don't even think it was that. Something, a really small stone, and it's been scalar imprinted, and it's $395. And there's a whole slew of those things. You get a whole page of them. I have a whole page in another presentation. So what is this scalar that is so expensive? And why is it important in radionics? That's what we're going to discuss right now. Well, scalar, now we're talking scalar electromagnetics at the moment, then I'll talk about what a scalar is, and I won't get too technical, but I'll give you enough information to where you can get an overview of this and really grok it. To produce a scalar electromagnetic field, we put a positive signal in one side. Now this is like a Mobius coil. So it's one piece of wire that goes back and forth, and we're going to put, at the same time, whatever energy we put in this side on the plus side, we'll put a negative charge on this side, and we put them in simultaneously, and it cancels out the electromagnetic field. And Ilona did a nice demonstration this morning about that. To our scientists and our engineers at the moment, if you have no electro nor magnetic field, you don't have any type of field at all. Welcome, Jan. Glad you made it. But what you do have, so this is an example of an electromagnetic field. This is a sine wave, right? Okay? And if we have two of those sine waves working together, it would look like this. That would be like putting a plus on both sides and a plus on, or a negative on both sides, and it'll create this motion. But if you put the plus on one side and the negative on the other side, the movement stops. And so there's no sine wave, there's no motion, there's no electro, no magnetic, but you get twice as much of the pressure on the time-space continuum. And I go more into that in my book, deeper into the mathematics of that and how that works and all that, how we can figure that out. And this pressure on the time-space continuum is what we call the 0 point, or it brings down to a, we call it a standing wave in electromagnetic theory, but it creates a from my perspective, almost like a small black hole in time and space. It collapses it. And that's where we can put the information through, and it's instantaneously in the entire field. Or that's one way of looking at it, or instantaneously at the target, because we want to make a connection with the target. In this case would be your client. So this is our scalar amplifier module that's in the SE5, and it's also in our new unit, which is, we call it the balancing only unit, which later I'll talk about how you can multiply your efforts by having more balancing only units and have just one analysis unit, and then you can connect up several different computers and multiply your efforts. So this is the heart of the SE5 in one sense. It's 3 scalar modules, 3 scalar amplifiers, and the coils are wound in a way that on the back side of this printed circuit board we have the mirror of that coil. So basically whenever there's a signal going in one side, it's pressing on that scalar field from the other side and keeping this pulse not moving electromagnetically, but it's creating that pressure in time-space. And this little module is where we feed all the information into. It's connected to, this is the rub plate antenna under here with the geometric forms, and it has another type of scalar field in it. So, what is scalar? Imagine, if you could, that nothing existed. Absolutely nothing. Okay? No dimensions, no time, no space, no nothing. We don't have anything that exists. But all of a sudden, we have a point in space. And if you want to call that point the 0 point, that's okay, but whatever it is, it's just a point in space. At this point, there's no information about this point. It's just a point in space, and there's nothing else that exists. So we don't have any scalar or any informational field yet. But we give this point in space a number, for example. It will create not only the information that this point is number 3, for example, in this example, it also implies in the next dimension or the non-dimension both point 2 and point 4. It's defining itself. And this is what we would call the scalar informational field. Now there's no energy associated with this, but there's a lot of information. And this informational field will begin to create what we would call a gravitational field. And in order to get anti-gravity on this physical plane, you know, Einstein said it's not possible to have anti-gravity on the bench, which I know several inventors who have proven that to be wrong, using scalar electromagnetics. They collapse the electromagnetic field and it doubles the gravitational field, and of course if you invert that, then you have twice as much non-gravity or anti-gravity. So a scalar field actually will start attracting, we call it in physics, we call it subtle attractors. They start automatically attracting the informational fields or the resonant fields of everything that would be in relationship or in harmony with the number 3. So you could be, like for example the Fibonacci series, right? Those are all resonant frequencies of a particular mathematical geometrical form. And we're still talking way non-physical. We're not talking about here us humans thinking about this stuff. We'll go into that next. Where does it come from? But before we get that, let me tell you what a vector is. So let's say we have one scalar, the number 3. In order to get a vector, you need to have at least 2 scalars. So in this case, we have the number 3, and we have the number 4, and that will give us our vector. We have to have movement. All vectors have to have movement to create energy. You don't have energy without movement. Right? You can have informational fields, you can have definition, you can have meaning. In order to have energy, you need to have movement. And that's why you need to have at least 2 scalar fields to create movement. Does that make sense? Okay, you guys are with me. So now we're going to get a little bit more esoteric, but not too much, but a little bit. So this is what I call the pyramid of manifestation. And at the top, this would be considered the 0 point that I talked about, that point in space. Yeah. So if nothing at all existed, we could call that the universal substance or God or whatever you want to name it. And if there's a point in space, that's what I would consider to be soul. Uh-oh. I know that music.
Very sure.
He's trying to get ahead and watch my films on YouTube before.
That's what I was actually trying to do. Yeah, let's speed it up. I don't know how to use the computer.
Okay, so we've got soul as the original point, let's say, in space, with no scalar, no information, but it's a definition of the universal. We'll just call it that. We don't really know any of this anyway. We're just making it up as we go. Okay, and then before we have any real information, we have what would be called the causal level or the causal archetypes. And I would describe this as God thinking and starting to make up the universe. Anyway, we call them causal archetypes, and these would be the blueprints, the actual blueprints for what's going to come next. After we have this basic blueprint, then we can have meaning or informational fields. So the blueprints, when they come, this is a descending level here. We're going to get to the physical level. This is a descending level, and when the causal archetypes are in place, then it can create meaning or have information, and that's what the scalar level is. And this is the level that we're working with the SE5. So once you have two scalars, of course, you can create a vector like I showed you before. And then once you have vectors, you can have energy. So this is our first level of energy. We would call it that subatomic level. Photons, quarks, things like that. Once we have subatomic particles or non-particles, then we can have the atomic nuclear level. Once we have atomic energy, then we can get to that etheric level or the electrical level. Then you can actually have charge. You can have a nuclear charge. The electrical charges then will combine together to create the chemicals in the molecular level. That's where you get your chemicals from. And then the molecules will combine to create cells. Cells will combine to create tissue. Tissue will create organs when they combine together. And then finally, at the end, we get the organism combining the organs together. And it doesn't stop here, it's really a circle. So then if you continued from here, the organisms will then mate together and create family systems. The family systems will create social systems. Social systems will create world systems. World systems will create galactic systems. Galactic systems will create universal systems, and that's kind of like up there somewhere. Again, does that make sense? Okay, now, just real quick, we do have, from a medical standpoint, we do have treatments at most of these levels. So for example, this is the most favorite one here. If the organism is sick, you get rid of the organism and the disease is healed. Right? That's the most popular one in America, as far as I know. The second most popular is, okay, we don't have to take out the whole organism, we'll just take out the organ. And then the disease is healed. If the organ is diseased, we'll just take out the organ. Of course, less invasive is just taking out some tissue from one of the organs. You don't have to take out the whole organ, they just scrape out some of it. Cellular therapy is, again, less invasive, and that's coming in from biotech, and we're starting to get nanotechnology where we'll go in and work at the cellular level. Chemicals, now, obviously, this is realistically the most favorite one, which is the pharmaceutical level here, is to put in some different chemicals which affects the cells, which affects the tissues, which affects the organ, and again, most of the time the organism dies, but we won't talk about that. Electrical, yeah. Remember Raymond Rife? Here, we've got him up here. But we also have some things like heart pacers, and there's a little bit of electromedicine in the world still, but most of it's been stamped out due to the chemical success, or monopoly, let's put it that way. Nuclear medicine, well, that's radiation therapy, for example. You can tell I'm not real in favor of the pharmaceutical, normal medical system, but they do have their place, don't get me wrong. Like, if I was in an accident, emergency systems, I would want to go to the best hospital with the best doctors. You know, for patching things up and putting things back together, there is nothing like them. I think they're phenomenal. These guys are amazing. When it comes to health, that's another story. They don't know, they're never trained in it. Subatomic level, of course, photons, we've got light therapy coming up here. Vector therapy, that could be even sound, any type of movement of energy. Sound therapy could be is a vector. Another thing about vectors, vectors are stronger at the source, and the further away from the source you get, the weaker they get. You know, all vectors are that way. So, if I talk without the microphone, for example, the people in the front are hearing me better than the people in the back. It's just louder. The information is the same, correct? They understood me just as well as she did up here.
What?
Always got to have somebody in the crowd. Okay, and then that's the scalar informational level, which is what we believe we're working with in radionics. Causal archetype level, this is where hypnosis would come in, realistically. This would be the mind medicine, the guided meditations, getting out of the body and meeting with other beings and guides, and then the soul therapy. Of course, we have soul retrieval type of therapies where the soul kind of gets knocked out of the body too far and it can't get back, and people get sick from it, and then they get the soul back in the body, and then everything heals. The Hawaiians did really well at this type of work. Now, the other thing that's very interesting about this is that I pretty much feel the higher you go in this range, or toward the top of the chart, the more effective or the more complete the healing is. Let's call it more complete, if you have enough time. It all comes down to time. So, obviously, if a person has appendicitis, I wouldn't do soul retrieval for them. I would deal with the problem at a very dramatic level, depending on, again, how much time they have. But there's not a lot of time with appendicitis. But each one of these you need more time to affect the healing process. But as you go closer and closer to the bottom, the less complete, I would call it, the less complete the healing process is. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Any questions on the world as we know it? This is the world according to Don, but... Okay. This is just a short experiment that we did, one of my students did, with some energized water. Use the SE5 to charge a crystal, and then charge the water with the crystal, and put some other flowers in normal tap water, and then just did time-lapse photography. And here is where it gets real dramatic. Oh, eventually one went over and charged water. So the question is, do intrinsic data fields make a difference? Okay, 348 hours later, pretty much. That was 14 and a half days later. And then this was a nice, that's after 11 days. These are pretty much gone here on the left, and the ones on the right have still quite a lot of life force in there. And from the top view, you can really see it. That's a really hanging down. So about 25% increase of life expectancy on those flowers. So if we translate that into human terms, if you had a 25% increase of your life expectancy, you might get another 20, 25 years out of it. This was another experiment. This one was, these were nectarines. This one was charged up with some IDF patterns with the SE5, and this one wasn't. They were just set on the, just one time, just a one-time informing of this particular peach. And it did pretty well. This one was already falling down and getting brown. It's a little more dramatic in the computer. These were some experiments done in Germany. They were having acid rain damage in the forests of Austria. And there was an institute in Cologne, Germany, which is about 500 miles away. And they were asked to work on this forest with the SE5. And so they did this over a period of 3 years. And this is what it looked like 3 years later. This was another experiment they did on another forest, same problem, and this was 3 years later. And this is about 500 miles away. And they worked on forests as far, they had 15 SE5s, and they worked on forests as far away as South Africa from Cologne, Germany, with astounding results. And yeah, did great things. This was back in the old days with the old SE5, but it's basically the same thing. I'm going to give you a really quick, I know you guys have heard these things 100 times, but I've got some pictures you've probably never seen before. So we all know, who doesn't know the, just so I know, who doesn't know the history of radionics? Is there anybody that doesn't know? A couple people, okay. I'll just do it quickly, and I'm not going to go into it in depth, but it's important, as you'll see as we get toward the end of it, why, because part of it is the history, and it'll really come into play in the third part of my talk, so you understand where things kind of went haywire. Yeah. But Albert Abrams was a medical doctor, started, I think he was about 16 when he got his medical degree in the United States and was too young to practice, so he went to Germany and got another medical degree. Needless to say, he was a very smart guy. One of the common diagnostic methods of his time, this was in the early 1900s, was to percuss on the stomach, and if there was a pain in an area, they would know that there was a problem there. But one day, he was percussing on one of his patients, this is Albert, after he'd figured this out, but he was doing percussion, and he heard a hollow sound in one area of the body. And he went home thinking about it, going, that is really strange, I've never heard that before. So he invited the patient back the next day and tapped on him again, and there was no sound. And this is really weird, because he really heard it. He thought he was kind of going nuts, but went home again and thought about what was different the day before. And so the main thing that he could think of was that the patient had been facing a different direction. So he called him back again, and he tried all 4 directions, and he found out that this sound appeared only when the patient faced west. In his mind, he's thinking, okay, west, we've got north, south, we've got the magnetic pole. It must be some kind of an electromagnetic type of reaction that's happening here. And so he started mapping these things, and he could find eventually that depending on where the sound was, this hollow tone, and I'm talking this was loud enough, they said that when he would do an example of this in an auditorium without microphones, this was way before all that stuff, people could hear it in the entire auditorium. It sounded like a drum. I've never heard it myself. It was before my time. But he started mapping different diseases. He figured out that when this hollow sound was in a particular place, that person had this particular disease. And so he could differentiate between, let's say, cancer or diabetes, depending on where that sound was happening. As he did more and more research, he figured out that there were several diseases that would show up the same hollow sound in the same place. So, one of the problems he had was that some people were too sick to pound on them. So we got this idea. I wonder what would happen if we put a spot of blood on a copper plate, and we ran a wire across to another copper plate, and we had a healthy person stand on that other plate. I think actually first he just put the sick person on one plate and the healthy person on the other one, tapped on the healthy person, and they reproduced those sounds. So those vibrations, or that electromagnetic radiation, or whatever you wanted to call it, was swapping over to the healthy person. so he could then test really sick people on a healthy person. And somewhere along the way, some of these people were too sick to even come in the office, so he thought, okay, I wonder if a spot of their blood would still cause that in a healthy person. They put the spot of blood on the copper plate, the healthy person reacted. And so he was really flying with this stuff, amazing stuff. How he got these ideas, I mean, he must have been pretty tuned in. But one of the main problems was that, like I said, several diseases would show up on the same place on the body. And so he developed this little resistance box, thinking this was an electrical type of radiation, where he could dial in a different resistor, and like 30 ohms, for example, would allow cancer to go through, would block everything else. If cancer and diabetes were on the same part of the body, I don't know exactly which ones they were, but this little box would filter out, it was like a filter, would filter out the disease that wasn't there and let through the radiations of the disease that was there, and he was able to then much more accurately diagnose those problems. So these are some of the early instruments. These came from Marcel Vogel's Museum of Radionic Instruments, the photos, courtesy of USPA, and who now has that collection, I believe. Anyway, he got the idea then, if this is an electrical radiation, he could then perhaps create some type of a broadcasting radio frequency type device and replace those frequencies, and perhaps the person would get better. And that worked, as we know. And Ruth Drown was one of his students, and when they put Abrams in jail and got rid of him, and you know, his whole story, most of these guys have the same story, but then she continued his work. She was a chiropractor, and she developed, oh yeah, one important thing, this was a really important thing. Eventually they came up with the idea, and again, I don't know how these leaps happened, but he got the idea, if this is an electrical radiation, instead of pounding on the stomach, maybe he could use a glass rod and it would have some kind of electrical effect. And it would create like a static or a rubbing, bumping, sticking kind of sensation over that area with the glass rod. And so Ruth Drown then took that same idea and she created the first rub plate, which then, and this was a self-contained unit then, you could put the spot of blood in there. You could use a pendulum over the plate, which is what this picture is showing, or you could actually rub on the plate. Yeah, Ludi.
And right at that time was World War I, and they were just really working with radio waves. And that was in everybody's mind. And they were also, as soon as the radio wave came out, because we were at war, they had to do some coding. And so all of that was going on, and Samuel Hoffman, who was the engineer, was an expert in that early pioneer time of radio waves. So it's important to realize that that's where the thinking was, and so those ideas kind of came with that kind of clothing on them.
That's a really good point. That basically, that's where the world was at, that's where the technological level was at, so that was natural to think that's what was happening. So Ruth created quite a few instruments. This was her big HVR console, where she could put in multiple tunings or rates here, and of course then, you know, her story the same. She ended up in jail as well. World War II broke out after World War I. World War II broke out. George Deloire had been working with Ruth Drown and getting his instruments from her. And when World War II broke out, they were not allowing any shipments of anything back and forth from the U.S. to Europe. And so George started building his own units. And this is one of George's units. And of course, he continued on and developed the Deloire camera and all these different things. And of course, when they tried to put George into jail, and it went to court and did the whole phony thing, the judge's wife had been cured of cancer with one of George's devices, and it became legal in England, which it still is today, as long as they work underneath of a medical doctor. Yeah, so George did a lot of great stuff. And then came Galen. Galen was also a radio engineer, and I don't really know how he got his ideas, or any of these guys, where they got their ideas from, but he started studying radionics and created the unit that got the first patent. The only patent on a radionics instrument was Galen Hieronymus. And then he published how to build these in Popular Science, Popular Mechanics, and people all over the world started building them themselves. And I think that was the saving grace probably for radionics and why it still exists today, because I think it could have easily been swept under the rug with all this. And then somebody came up with the idea, and I don't really know, there's a whole story about this. It was one of the people that was a magazine writer, editor or something, started playing with one of George's schematics that he had published and figured out that it worked without the machine. So, where did the electromagnetic theory go? It went out the window at this point, which was not entirely true. I mean, there are electromagnetic functions and aspects to all of this. But this was powered by the person's own energy field or their own psychic ability. And now that we've studied this more, we understand why. Because if we have two sides of our brain that run independently and together, but they send out quite a few different, they're, mostly in sine waves. If you turn on both sides of your brain at the same time, what happens? You get your pressure. You get that scalar pressure. And you can create with your own brain, if you can go whole-brained, the aha moment or the zone moment for musicians, you can then focus that information or that energy or that idea, your intention, we call it the intention, and you can get effects with your own brain. And I believe that's how this worked. This helps the brain kind of come into focus and focus the intent with a diagram. The interesting thing is that if you drew the diagram differently, it didn't work. So there's some connection here that we're still trying to figure out, but it's really interesting. So Galen was certainly a big step forward in the radionic world. And Galen and Bill, Dr. Willard Frank, he went by Dr. Willard Frank. It was his name was William Francis Lawson. So you could call him Bill Lawson was what he went by with friends, but he went by Dr. Willard Frank. He was a Ph.D. physicist, and he was a friend of Galen's, and he started this a long time ago. He was an inventor. He created a lot of high-end audio products, audiophile type patents, and that's where he kind of lived from that, and radionics was his hobby. But he started a long time ago. He did the Vitatron, the Nutritron, the Digitron, the SE5, the SE5 Plus, and this was the world's first digital radionics unit. It had memory. You could sequence rates one after the other, and it was a very fine instrument. It just was quite big and heavy and bulky, and then after the Digitron, he went one step further and created the first SE5, which had the little sharp calculator on it. It was actually a little computer. It could make a couple custom programs, but it was quite limited in memory, very limited in memory. But it had quite a few programs inside of it, and you could make a couple of your own. And then after Sharp stopped making this one, they created Sharp started making this particular, the 1270, or we called it now the Psi computer, which had more memory. You could make about 16 custom programs, and it still had room for pre-built programs. So what is the advantage of having digital over analog radionic units? Anybody got a clue? Yes?
Time?
Time, absolutely. I mean, the analog units, don't get me wrong, they're phenomenal. They're still better than most everything out there in the world. They're psycho-interactive, they're consciousness interactive units that the world is. I think we're going to see this in our lifetime. We're going to see this transition from pure physical to consciousness interactive technology. But radionics has been doing that for 100 years, and the old units are really good units. Do not get me wrong. But in our day and age, things have sped up so much. With the addition of computers, you can do a whole lot more in a whole lot less time. Yeah, Ludi.
And the other critical thing is if your style of radionics is a single setting or maybe two settings, that the older units are great, but if your style is a series, then those take so long.
Yeah.
And so the series of rates with a common focus or purpose on these instruments, you know, and it just has to do with your particular style.
Right. It has to do with your style and focus and a lot of how you've been trained. But once you see what you can do nowadays with the addition of the computing power combined with some of the traditional radionic ideas, it's just about mind-blowing. We're going to get to that in just a couple minutes. You'll get to see for yourself. But I got a couple more little examples. These were some seeds, and these seeds were not informed with any informational fields, and these seeds were informed with informational fields of life force and nitrogen and all the nutrients that they might need. And after 10 days, they were dug up, and you can see for yourself which one has more life force. It's another experiment. This one I did. That one was done in Germany. This one I did. I did it with some lettuce seeds, and the top ones were not informed at all. And these were in the same growing box, you know, like little boxes where you plant every seeds. And I kind of knew ahead of time what was going to happen, so I only took out like 10 seeds. The rest of them didn't even grow up here. That's why I only have 4. But I think I had 10 seeds that I didn't inform or, you know, put IDFs into. And the rest of the package I did because I figured that was going to work. So I pulled out 4 of the growing ones because I wanted to keep the rest of them and plant them. And these 4 were the only ones that even grew, and the rest of them didn't even germinate. So from this simple test, I mean this is a very small test, and Ludi can attest to this, you can get a much higher germination rate if you energize your seeds first or inform them. Yeah? This then, I planted the seeds. These are my lettuce plants that I was growing in lava rock, and this was a fish tank, and so the fish tank would gravity feed the water through each one of the trays, and then it would collect here, and this was a tank over here which would collect the water, and then I had a solar powered pump that would pump the water back into the fish tank. So in essence, this was my filtration system for the fish, and the fish tank then produced the food or the fertilizers that my plants needed. So it was a nice little holistic system. I did that in Hawaii. Okay, so I'm not sure why I have that picture in there. Let's go right to the SE5. Okay, we're going to do a demo. Oh, I know what it was. It was advertisement. You should buy my book. I have my books here for sale.
So subliminal.
What's that?
It was so subliminal.
Yeah, right. I did it real quick, didn't I? Okay, so now I would like to, yes, I have a question over here.
Is the SE5 a Hieronymus circuit?
It is not a Hieronymus circuit. It is, how would I describe it? It relies on scalar electromagnetics. So what Bill's expertise was in scalar electromagnetics. He was also an electrical engineer, and besides being a Ph.D. physicist, and he used and understood the benefits of using scalar electromagnetics. Nobody else had done that before. Yeah. So Tesla was experimenting with those things back in his day, but nobody knew what Tesla was even about until the last 20 years, you know. But what Bill did was he figured out if we use some scalar electromagnetics, we could take this up a whole nother level. Because it's not about power, it's about the clarity of the signal. And the beauty of scalar electromagnetics is you get point A to point B transmission without any loss. Zero loss transmission. Yeah? That's what Tesla was doing with his electricity. He could send electricity from point A to point B wirelessly and have no loss. Yeah?
Bill who?
Bill Lawson, the guy I showed you before. Dr. Willard Frank. I've referred to him in my book as Dr. Willard Frank, but his name was Bill Lawson. I worked together with Bill for about 23 years. He was my best friend for probably 20 of those years. We hit it off right away, and we spent a lot of time together. And it was just a wonderful and brilliant person, brilliant man. So, to answer your question, this is about scalar electromagnetics, and I had another good friend, Eldon Bird. Some of you may remember him from, he was in USPA for a long time as well. And Eldon was an expert also in scalar electromagnetics, as was Bob Beck. And those three guys were basically my, you know, we always said we were part of the Mutual Admiration Club. The four of us really had a good bond together. And it was all around scalar electromagnetics. And Eldon had worked in scalar weaponry for the military. And he told me that they created some terrible things with scalar. Scalar can be used well, and it can be used for some really horrible things. And he said the best day of his life was when, I think it was when Clinton took over. They came into his office and they said, "Oh, we're shutting down this division, and we want you to burn all the material that you've created for the last 20 years." He said it was the happiest day of his life because they had created some crazy things. But some of the good things that they did create was, like, for example, being able to use scalar signals through a mountain, and they could communicate through the mountain itself without bouncing. If there were bad weather conditions or anything like that, they could set up a scalar field go right through the mountain, and they could get communication going that way. Because it's lossless, and it has, since there's no frequencies, there's no interference. It's quite a deep subject. You know, it's a very deep subject.